Welcome to How to Fix It. I'm John Avlon. One of the most urgent issues facing America and the world today is the apparent realignment by the Trump administration towards Russia, a pivot to Putin. There's been a long list of policy choices this administration has made right out of the gate to remove guardrails that had been around Russian attempts to interfere in our domestic politics, to remove barriers to kleptocracy. And of course, after kicking Zelensky out of the Oval Office, there seems to be a sense that America is, for the first time in our history, certainly modern history, aligning with an aggressor against a democracy that has been invaded. This threatens to upend the American-led order that was put in place after the Second World War, where the alliance of democracies held autocracies at bay. This is a time where we need to confront that fact coldly and coolly, and yet also point out, as our next guest does, that Donald Trump's pivot to Putin does not represent the vast majority of American opinion. It does not represent American tradition, which has been bipartisan. And there may indeed still be bipartisan coalitions that can be found to stop that desecration of America's deepest values. Our guest today has had a front row seat at negotiations with Vladimir Putin over a period of decades. It's the former United States ambassador to Russia, Mike McFaul. He is the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Mike is going to talk about Vladimir Putin. He's going to talk about his assessment of this shift and what we can do about it as Americans to make sure that 4 years of a Trump administration does not mean the desecration of NATO and the abandonment of our fellow democracies. So in the last few days, the CIA has apparently cut off intelligence sharing with Ukraine in the middle of the war. The White House, Trump, ordered a pause on, quote unquote, pause on congressionally approved military aid to Ukraine, apparently in retaliation for the Oval Office meeting. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth ordered U.S. Cyber Command to cease offensive cyber operations and information operations against Russia. Before that, on her first day in office, Attorney General Pam Bondi ordered the effort to seize assets of Russian oligarchs and others, various kleptocrats, taken offline. She also ordered a halt on federal enforcement initiatives to combat secret influence operations of Russia. I mean, this pattern is stunning. When you see that pattern, the policies they are pursuing, not just the attitude and the rhetoric and the instincts, what does that tell you?
Well, that's a pretty overwhelming list, isn't it, John? And I could add to it. They've also told the Ukrainians that they have to give up territory to Putin. They've also told the Ukrainians no membership in NATO. President Trump has invited Vladimir Putin to rejoin the G7. The list is pretty long of concessions to Putin and pressure on President Zelensky and the Ukrainians. And there's only two explanations. One is that the Trump administration are just incredibly bad negotiators. Everybody talks about him being the deal maker, the art of the deal. Maybe what works in New York and real estate deals is one thing, but this is not the way you do deals with Vladimir Putin. You don't just give all the concessions in the beginning. By the way, you don't give them in public. The fact that the list you just read is also bad diplomacy. And so that's one explanation. They just don't know what they're doing. And I've negotiated with these guys. They're tough negotiators. This is not the way you negotiate with them. But the second explanation is that President Trump actually does not really care about negotiating an end to the war. And what he really cares about is restoring his personal relationship with Vladimir Putin. And I don't know which of those two are true, but the evidence is pretty overwhelming that being in good graces with Putin, giving these concessions as a way to win him over is what Trump is really animated by. And that to me is tragic because I don't believe that is in America's national interest.
It is not in America's national interest. And as you've pointed out, it's contrary to our bipartisan tradition. It's contrary to our deepest values. identifying with associated with an aggressor nation as opposed to the countries that have been invaded and bullied. And it's also contrary to public opinion. But if you were on the other side of that negotiating table, as you have been in the past, given the current circumstances we are in, what tack would you take?
On the American side, correct?
On the American side, yes. Needless to say.
So the first thing I would do is stop negotiating in public. It just doesn't work. Whether it's the Oval Office meeting or the messages on social media, the people you just quoted, that is imprudent. The second thing I would do is I would start a negotiating process where it's a trade of concessions, not just giving Putin everything up front. I was part of the team that negotiated the New START Treaty, and people can decide whether that was good or bad, but we did get rid of 30% of the nuclear weapons in the world at the time. And to do so, we had to make trades with the Russians, right? We had to say, we'll do this, we would do this for you. And we had to have some red lines. So for us in that negotiation, one of our red lines was we're not going to put any constraints on our missile defenses. And you've got to establish those. And so the American team, Secretary Rubio and his team, needs to start thinking in those terms. And the important piece of that, if we get into the real details of what would lead to an enduring peace, is there has to be some guarantee from our side to the Ukrainians that can give them some assurance that a ceasefire is not just a temporary ceasefire that will lead to a bigger war down the road. Because, and maybe they don't remember, maybe they forgot, or maybe they never knew, but when the vice president was berating President Zelensky for not trying to give negotiations a chance, either he forgot or he never knew that President Zelensky actually already did sit down with Vladimir Putin. And there were Europeans at the table, by the way. The Americans were not there. This was under the Trump administration, by the way. They also seem to have forgotten that the war in Ukraine started in 2014 and endured for the entire Trump administration. But Zelensky was a new guy. He was newly elected. He sat down with Putin. They signed a ceasefire. And then 3 years later, Putin unleashed his full-scale invasion, a much bigger invasion than even he did in 2014. So for President Zelensky, and not just Zelensky, the Ukrainian people, remember, this is not a dictatorship, unlike Russia. He can't just make decisions. They need something more than just signing a piece of paper ending the hostilities, and that's the piece that the American side and the European side need to get serious about.
I mean, this raises, I think, a lot of the times the people who are sort of apologists for this pivot to Putin do it under the name of realpolitik, right?
Yeah.
But the ultimate realpolitik stress test is that as the invasion of Crimea and its aftermath would show, that if you don't stand up to aggressors, you get more aggression. That's one of the basic lessons of history.
Yes.
So are they willfully blind to that, or do you think there's a new world order they are imagining?
Well, that's a great question that I don't have a great answer to, but I'm glad you raised this word realism, which I have lots of trouble with in academia, but we don't have time to talk about that. But don't believe Mike McFaul. I want your viewers to go read John Mersheimer. He is one of the leading realist theorists in the world today. And John has some really wacky ideas from my point of view about Ukraine, but read his classic book about the tragedy of great powers. And he says, John, exactly what you just said. Appeasement for aggressive rising powers does not work. I'm paraphrasing now, but it just whets their appetite to ask for more. And tragically, that's exactly what we're seeing today. So you just went through the long list of concessions already given. You know what Putin's response to that has been? Oh, that's great. Thank you. I'm putting those in my pocket. But now I have some more requests. For instance, I want to limit the numbers of soldiers that can be in the Ukrainian army. That's one of his new requests. Second, I want to limit the weapons that Ukraine can buy. Third, we can't have peacekeepers in Ukraine. In other words, he's asking to more demands of the Ukrainians that violate their sovereignty. And the paradox of that, of course, is he talks about sovereignty all the time, but when it's for Russia, it's okay. When it's for anybody else, it's not okay. But that's exactly what's happening, right? It's these concessions are not getting him to stop. They're actually encouraging him for more. And that gets me to the central thing I worry most about. If we pause and disarm the Ukrainians, we stop sharing intelligence, which is vital for their targeting. What's going to happen if you're Vladimir Putin? He thinks, I can win. He thinks, I can go all the way to Kiev now because my enemy's being disarmed. They're being thrown under the bus by their most important military partner. And I have seen no hints whatsoever in the Russian press, from Putin, from his close advisors, from his propagandists. And I watch Russian TV, so you don't have to. I've seen absolutely no hint that after all of these concessions, that he is not, that he is committed to his original objectives that he started at the beginning of this war. And that is to subjugate all of Ukraine. And number two, to overthrow Zelensky, by the way. That's now also on the table. And when he hears some of our senators saying the same thing, he cannot believe it, his luck. And then one of his third was demilitarization. Those are still all on his list. And we have not, we can't just keep agreeing to things. We got to start pushing back on some of Putin's demands.
To your point, one of the fundamental failures in a negotiation is to make concessions on the front end, which has been done unilaterally and across the board. You've known Putin. You've dealt with Putin for, I think, 3 decades now. And you've commented that you never would have guessed Republicans were the ones. The party of Reagan was the one that was going to all of a sudden embrace Russia. And any sense of history would give you whiplash. On the other hand, we have seen this sort of glowing, romanticization of Putin on a certain wing of the Republican Party. It used to be called paleo-conservative.
Yes.
Before the invasion of Ukraine, I think Newsmax had a cover lionizing him.
Yes.
But this was part of a tradition. So just as someone who knows Putin, who didn't look in his eyes and see his soul, but looked in his eyes and saw KGB, disabuse that crew of the notion of the idea that he's a reasonable, rational actor.
So I'm glad you brought this up because in my view, we in the West, and particularly in the United States, and even when I served in the government, most certainly, we underestimated this ideological affinity between Vladimir Putin and populist nationalist movements in Europe and here in the United States. Putin, he didn't start this way, right? We probably don't have to go back to the beginning. He started being anti-democratic from the get-go. And I wrote my first critical piece of Putin in the Washington Post in March of 2000, literally a quarter century ago. So that was clear from the beginning. But he did flirt with President Bush about being, united against the global war on terror. By the way, domestically, he also, back then we would have labeled him at the Hoover Institution. We would have called him a conservative, right? He cut taxes, corporate taxes, flat tax. That's a Hoover idea, by the way. It comes from the Hoover Institutions. We've never done it here in the United States. He did it, 13% flat tax in his early years. But over time, he shifted, and he became obsessed with what he believed is an American conspiracy to destroy Russia, to weaken Russia. And the second piece of that, in a very ideological way, and he's very explicit. Putin is crystal clear, by the way. You don't need to be a Sovietologist to understand him. He's about as blunt as you can get. He became obsessed with, in his view, kind of defending traditional values, traditional Russian culture and values from the liberal, decadent West. A piece of that, he's super obsessed with issues of sexual orientation, by the way, and controlling LGBT groups inside his country. They have this phrase this is a decade ago, by the way, gay Europa, right? And that we've got to defend our country, our homeland, from these decadent liberal values. And then after consolidating power inside Russia, he went on the offensive externally, and he started funding instruments of ideological promotion. So we've all heard of RT now, right? Russia Today. That's a weapon in that. Sputnik does the same thing. Army of people on social media all over the place in our country, but all other countries, by the way, pushing this ideological agenda. I really want to emphasize that. It's not just about transactions. Yes, he's transactional. Yes, he's a thug, but he's also got this ideological orientation. And I emphasize that because when I was in the government, people would say, oh, he's transactional. And I would say, yeah, he's transactional. And he's got this other thing. By the way, Stalin was a thug and he also had an ideology. That notion that you can't have both was always strange to me. And that's what he's done. Pat Buchanan was an early person that they courted. Then they brought a bunch of evangelical leaders to Russia when I was ambassador. And we would see these meetings with the Russian Orthodox Church. And you can imagine they have a shared set of ideas, right? Think about issues of abortion, LGBT, and that he was cultivating this very, very clearly. And now today, MAGAism and Putinism on X, there's this guy, Alexander Dugin, who's one of their chief ideologues. 20 years ago, by the way, Dugin was a marginal character. Now he's become mainstream in a way like Alex Jones was a marginal character 20 years ago. Now he's much more mainstream. Alex Jones and Dugin, they're like on each other's podcasts now. And that's the explanation for how they're together. What they get wrong, what the Joneses of the world get wrong, and in my view, President Trump, is they think that by talking and about this macho guy and return to machoism and anti-multiculturalism and anti-internationalism, by the way, they also share this view against multilateral institutions. Putin wants to destroy NATO. The MAGA folks want to destroy NATO, right? But what they get fundamentally wrong is Putin hates us. He wants to weaken America. He wants to divide America. He wants greater polarization in our society so that we are weakened in the international system. He has no love for us. And he understands by flirting with one side, he's no fool. He understands that there might be a new election and somebody else will come along. He knows that this is not some long-term strategic partnership. This like ridiculous notion that we're going to do some Nixon goes to China with Putin. Putin's not going to do that. He's not going to abandon Xi Jinping and his autocratic comrades to take a ride for a couple of years with Trump. And that's the part they fundamentally don't get, that he has no interest in supporting our long-term interests. It's exactly the opposite. And I want to end one more thing on this. This is a guy at a young age who joined the KGB. There is no greater anti-Christian organization in the 20th century than the KGB. And they have a thing that they say, once you're in the system, you're never out of the system. He celebrates the anniversary of the KGB every year with his KGB comrades. And so, yes, he'll say this stuff about Christianity, but they fundamentally are against these ideas. I personally don't think he's an actual conservative, but I know for sure that he's anti-American, and there would be nothing he would want to see more than the destruction of America.
Let's talk about that ideological warfare. The KGB used to promote something called active measures, ideological subversion. There's talk of something called Project Russia, an attempt to sow division and dissent, not only discredit democracies, but particularly sowing division and dissent in the United States. We saw some indictments by the Department of Justice, the previous administration, of right-wing influencers online for parroting Russian talking points. They were getting money. But what do you think the state of those active measures are, of the ideological subversion designed to discredit democracy and undermine American democracy in particular?
Yeah, John, that's a big, hard topic. And in part because of the politics in our country, social scientists don't want to study it anymore because they're being accused of, violating alleged First Amendment rights of Americans. So there's not the study of it that there used to be online. My own view is there are two things that can be happening at the same time. One, Putin and his minions, the instruments of influence that he has. And, I just mentioned a few, but there are multiple, right? There are NGOs, there's the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, there's Russia World, there's traditional media, there's social media. They are flooding the zone with this multiple method strategy. And with two purposes. One is to support those that are pro-Putin. 2016, the president keeps trying to tell us that it didn't happen, but it did happen. There's overwhelming evidence for it, where his KGB, his intelligence officers stole data from, actually, in the Mueller report, if I'm doing this from memory, so if I'm not, I've correct me somebody, but I'm pretty sure they stole data from both parties, but they published the data from the Democratic Party to embarrass their candidate, Hillary Clinton. That's an example of what you're talking about. Now, I want to be clear. I know the social science on this. I have never seen a study that shows that the causal influence of their activities was significant enough to say without it, Trump wouldn't have won. I think we need to be really clear about that.
I agree with
that. Their intentions were crystal clear about they liked Trump and they didn't like Clinton. And Sputnik and RT were just blunt as you want. They're just clear as day. They weren't hiding it. But the second thing you emphasize, and I really want to stress this, because sometimes it's to be on one side or the other, but the bigger agenda is nurturing, fomenting polarization, division. Because that makes us weak, right? And not only us, it's happening in other countries. And that is also, part of their agenda.
It's a core part of their agenda. And in the past, when we had a U.S. tradition, going back to a misinterpretation of Washington's farewell address, but it was called non-interventionism. Some people called it oscillationism. It was a posture of American neutrality. What seems to be now is that this is not neutrality we're seeing. This does seem to be, actively undermining our democracies, Ukraine and fellow democracies vis-a-vis the tariffs, but also embracing. The Kremlin itself has said that now U.S. policy is largely aligned with Russia. Yeah. That's a sea change that is outside this sort of more traditionalist pose of neutrality that I think needs to be leaned on a lot more.
That's a great point, by the way. That is a really important point. It'd be one thing if they were, pivoting back to, neutrality and those older traditions in American history, but they're not. At least the president is not. I want to be careful. I don't know what Secretary Rubio or Mike Waltz thinks. I used to know what they think. I know very well what they used to think. Senator Rubio was on my, a member of the committee on my confirmation hearings, and we agreed on almost everything. And my kids were there, by the way, John, and I asked them afterwards, they're Democrats and Republicans, and they were young and they didn't really know who was who. And I asked them, who is their favorite? Rubio was their favorite, by the way. And a guy named Senator Menendez was the one they didn't like the most, just based on...
That's interesting.
Yeah, just a little footnote from history. But the point you're making is really important, because it's not neutrality. It's taking a side. I have a book coming out in the fall called Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, and the New World Order. And I was just joking with my editor earlier this week. By the time it comes out, it's not sure what side the United States might be on, with one caveat. That may be what the president wants to do. But we're still not a monarchy. And as you pointed out earlier, the American people don't agree with this, right? A Quinnipiac poll came out last week. 81% of the American people don't trust Putin. Only 9% do. And so what I think we need is a debate about this. If we're going to make the biggest shift in American foreign policy history in my lifetime, and maybe ever, we need to have a debate about it. Why are you doing this, Mr. President? What is good for the American people about embracing Vladimir Putin? By the way, he's Xi Jinping's closest ally. Like, what are you seeking to achieve here? And I really think we need to have that debate more front and center.
So let's lean into that debate. I know I'm on team democracy. Democracy versus autocracy, this is not a tough call for the vast majority of Americans. And that's where I want to go. You do make the point that Trump's actions, and he is the commander in chief for 4 years, and
Yes.
they don't reflect, though, American tradition or popular opinion. So this gets back to the question I'm hearing all the time from folks. What can we do? So what can citizens do? What can Congress do in this moment?
Well, first, a little history. I'm being, accused by folks on the right. I don't even know how to use that word anymore. I'll just say Trump supporters, that I am being disloyal to the president of the United States for criticizing him. And, this is inappropriate. And I just want to say, as an American citizen and as a student of American history and American foreign policy, there's nothing more un-American than telling Americans they can't criticize their president. That is just unheard of. That is not our traditions, to your point. Number two, there have been times in American history where society mobilized against what the president of the United States was trying to do on foreign policy. Yes, the president has a lot of power in the Constitution over foreign policy, but it is not absolute power. And, we can go back to the Vietnam War where society, there was popular mobilization against a war supported by the president, and it had a causal influence on our policy. Go back to Nixon. Nixon wanted to do a deal with the Soviets and he wanted to trade more with them. And he was pushing through the 1974 Trade Act. But there are two members of Congress, Senator Jackson and Congressman Vanik, that said, we actually care about human rights. We care about the rights of Jewish citizens in the Soviet Union. And they added to that Trade Act the Jackson-Vanik Amendment to the 1974 Trade Act to put pressure on the Soviets to allow Jewish immigration to Israel and the United States. That was not disloyal. That was part of their constitutional power. Anti-Apartheid Act. I'm trying to be the two side, Democrat and Republican sides, but on the Anti-Apartheid Act, Ronald Reagan, who, I think did a lot of great things in terms of American foreign policy. I'm a supporter, but he got one thing wrong: support for the apartheid regime. And the Congress passed in 1986 the Anti-Apartheid Act. So there is a tradition of society being mobilized to push against foreign policies that they think are wrong. And so, to your question, what is to be done? If you think it's wrong to pivot this way, you should make sure your members of Congress know, especially if you live in swing districts or Republican districts, that you think this is wrong. And I just met with several members of Congress just the other day, and I am constantly amazed and pleasantly pleased that those kinds of things have an impact on them. Phone calls have an impact on them. Showing up at town hall meetings have an impact on them. That's probably why we won't see very many coming up lately. But I think, it's not enough just to say we're against it. You have to express it in some way. And the most immediate way, of course, is to engage with the House, because that's the folks that are going to be up for re-election soonest.
And indeed, this may be an issue where we can form some kind of bipartisan coalition. There may be enough Republicans in the House and Senate who believe in being consistent about their principles, even though they have a bad track record recently of standing up to Trump. But maybe, just maybe, this might be an area where we can form a bipartisan coalition. Let's talk about NATO. Trump has tried to undermine NATO and basically threatened Article 5 repeatedly. Putin hates NATO. NATO has been probably the most successful multilateral organization in modern human history, certainly.
Yes.
And now the Europeans are talking about trying to come up with their own security apparatus. That is not because America has forced them into a position that they will look back on fondly. That's in reaction to the fact they don't know if they can trust the United States. But make a case for how NATO can survive in a hostile administration, and so that institution can endure even through 4 years when the United States is not ultimately its guarantor?
Again, super hard questions. I don't have great answers. But I think we should start with what you said, but I want to echo it and amplify it. This has been the greatest alliance in modern history. It has kept the peace mostly in Europe, most certainly among democratic allies in Europe. That is good for American security interests. Remember, we fought 2 wars in Europe when we didn't have that kind of security in Europe. We got dragged in to both of those wars, and we haven't had to go to war in Europe as a result of NATO keeping the peace. I think people need to remember that if NATO falls apart and Putin is poking around, I fear we're back to the 1930s. And, we can try to put our head in the sand and say what happens in Ukraine or Lithuania or Latvia doesn't matter for us. But man, that was a bad strategy in the 30s. And I just hope we don't repeat those mistakes today. Second, the European Union as a whole, they're some of our best trading partners and investment partners. The notion that we're going to sign up for this, this kleptocratic dictatorship of an economy called Russia and throw under the bus these incredibly enduring trading partners that's good for American prosperity, that's a giant mistake. Third, there's only been one time when Article 5 has been invoked. And Article 5 in the NATO treaty says, attack on one is attack on all. That's when we, the Americans, we were attacked on September 11th. And our allies went to war with us. They weren't attacked by Al-Qaeda. They weren't attacked by the Taliban, but our allies fought with us in Afghanistan. And I have to say, when our vice president disparages one of our oldest allies in the world, Great Britain, because they haven't fought a war in 30 or 40 years, obviously forgot about the several hundred British soldiers that died in Afghanistan and died in Iraq. Just shameful in my view. I wish these guys would study history before they pop off. And that's the other thing. Take diplomacy behind closed doors, folks, please. But they did that for us. And they provided economic assistance to our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So Churchill said it better than I could. The only thing worse than going to war is going to war alone. And it helps to keep the peace, to keep NATO there. So that's the argument for NATO. Now, to your harder question about what do we do in this period, I was in Europe. I was at Munich Security Conference a couple of weeks ago talking to Europeans about your very question. And I think the hope was at least keep the alliance intact for the next 4 years so that it might have the chance for regeneration and renewal in a post-Trump era. And I think that needs to be the strategy. But I wish it were better, but I think that's the best we can hope for.
Hopefully NATO can survive 4 years. The danger, obviously, is that something is done to trigger Article 5 and the U.S. doesn't step up.
Exactly.
But there needs to be an understanding that the Trump administration doesn't speak for the vast majority of the American people. I want to end you on another tough question. I've had this debate on air, and it's, what does victory look like? People say, look, the Donbass has been under Russian control. Zelensky may say, as a matter of principle, he wants all the land back. It's unlikely he will get that. So, and this is this idea that Trump is really all he wants is peace, right? And traditionally, when people have tried to appease autocrats in the name of peace, it never goes well. I just want to remind people of that. Yeah. So, to you, what does a reasonable victory in Ukraine look like that is not a victory for Vladimir Putin?
You're right. Really hard questions. And you're right about appeasement, right? I just was in Munich, and boy, were there a lot of people talking about Munich 1938 at that meeting. Appeasement didn't, negotiating with Hitler did not lead to peace. And there were lots of references to Yalta, by the way, too, like splitting up the world with Stalin. Only the metaphor, you have to change it because then you have to invite Hitler to the Yalta meeting, because that would be the equivalent of what we're doing now. So there's no easy ends to this war that are just and enduring. And that is true, and most certainly President Zelensky and his team understand that. Of course, they would want to restore their sovereignty to their 99-1 borders, but they have hinted that they understand that may not be something in the near future. To me, the tragic but necessary deal would involve an acknowledgement from President Zelensky that he will only seek unification of his country through peaceful means. And that means de facto, no more fighting to bring back Crimea and Donbass, as you just said. But in return for that, he needs assurances from us that to enhance deterrence so that there won't be the start of another war in 2 to 3 years. To me, that's the essence of an enduring deal. And by the way, if that happened, that would be a victory for the Ukrainians, because remember what Putin wanted. He wanted all of Ukraine. He doesn't have that. He wanted to overthrow Zelensky. He hasn't done that. You know, if you look at the map closely, the Russians have only made incremental progress in terms of what they've seized since what they de facto controlled before 2022, right? So that could be framed as a victory for Ukraine. And of course, Putin would have his victory parade and claim victory. And, you know, both sides can tell their own narratives. But a necessary condition is something more than just a piece of paper like happened before that we talked about. In my view, and I know it's not going to happen, but in my view, the best solution would be armistice one day, and the next day, Ukraine membership into NATO. That's what we did in South Korea, by the way. Even some folks from the White House, David Sachs, not exactly a fan of mine, but he just was tweeting about it the other day. You know, he works at the White House now. Oh, 1953 looks like a great solution. He's right. I agree completely. But I think he didn't know that, yeah, there was the armistice in June, and then we signed a treaty in October 1st, by the way, 1953. And that was the security guarantee that did two very important things. One, it made credible the deterrence that the North Koreans and their Chinese allies were not going to invade South Korea again. But you know what else it did? It constrained South Korea from invading the North again. And it's been a tragic divide of their country, but it's endured ever since. That's not on the cards with President Trump. He's made that clear. So the other piece has to be, what I would say a combination of two things: peacekeepers from Europe and massive military assistance for the Ukrainians, so that we give them the HIMARS and the Javelins and the ATACMS and the missile defenses and, everything, so that they are armed to the teeth, so that Putin will not be tempted to attack them in the future.
Mike McFaul, I want to thank you for joining us on How to Fix It. All your strategic insight is invaluable. It's also a reminder of what Harry Truman once said: the only thing new in the world is the history you don't know. And more people should study it.
Love that.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.